morning. My name is Tim Fox. I am a Presbyterian pastor in Austin. I have proudly avoided filing taxes in over 3 months. I'm going to be speaking to you from the strange and dark book of Ecclesiastes, which is an Old Testament book. I gave Jordan a couple of ideas for things I could talk about. He chose this one. He wanted me to rain on everybody's parade, I guess. And so don't blame me, just blame him.
Jacob from hell is better than not raining on the parade.
That's right. So we are in, this is a book called Ecclesiastes. This is part of a genre we call in the Bible the wisdom literature of the Bible. Probably the most famous example of it is the book of Job. Wisdom literature is wrestling with the many gray areas that come with living in God's world. God has spoken to us in His Word, but He does not tell us exactly how to apply it in every single situation. Wisdom literature wrestles with the many blessings and good sides of life in God's world, but also many of its dark sides. Ecclesiastes is mainly wrestling with the dark side of life here. So I'm going to not read the entire passage to you all for the sake of time. I'm going to read the second half of it. I think I have an outline up there for you guys. It's a kind of a complicated passage, but I'll read the second half of it. If you have a Bible on your phone or something, it would be good for you to pull it up. If you're new to the Bible, the big numbers we call chapters, the little numbers we call verses. I'll be referring to parts of it as I go along, even if you don't read on it along with it right now. So I'm going to start from Ecclesiastes chapter 5, starting at verse 18. We don't know exactly who wrote Ecclesiastes. Traditionally, we think Solomon wrote it, David's son, a king in Israel. Possibly somebody that came later than Solomon. It's somebody who's a king in Israel, somebody who has done it all and seen it all. He starts out the book talking about how he basically tried sex and money and power, and it got him nowhere. And so this is somebody who has exercised and seen the political world from the inside and has seen the emptiness of it all. But here's starting at verse 18 in chapter 5. We call him the preacher, or maybe the sage, this wise man. Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun the few days of his life that God has given him. For this is his lot. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil, this is the gift of God. For he will not much remember the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. There's an evil that I have seen under the sun, and it lies heavy on mankind. A man to whom God gives wealth, possessions, and honor, so that he lacks nothing of all that he desires. Yet God does not give him power to enjoy them, but a stranger enjoys them. This is vanity. It is a grievous evil. If a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with life's good things, and he also has no burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. For it comes in vanity, and it goes in darkness, and in darkness its name is covered. Moreover, it has not seen the sun or known anything, yet it finds rest rather than he. Even though he should live 1,000 years twice over, yet enjoy no good, do not all go to the one place? All the toil of man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is not satisfied. For what advantage has the wise man over the fool? And what does the poor man have who knows how to conduct himself before the living? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. Whatever has come to be has already been named, and it is known what man is, that he is not able to dispute with one stronger than he. The more words, the more vanity. And what is the advantage to man? For who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? For who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? Many of us here today understand that as a technology and as a phenomenon, Bitcoin is about something far more than money. all these things that we like to talk about Bitcoin fixing. But we would be kidding ourselves if we did not admit that our interest and passion for Bitcoin has a lot to do with money. The first sentence of Satoshi's abstract contains the words cash, payments, and financial institution. We also now, since he wrote that white paper, have all these little meme phrases in Bitcoin world like this. We say the number goes up. We say fix the money, fix the world. We tell people to have fun staying poor. We say that the money printer goes brrr. And of course, there's lots of other salty ones that a minister shouldn't say. The passage I just read to you is about money. But it's not just about money. It's about all kinds of wealth in this world. The wise preacher here is writing not only about stacking sats, so to speak, but also about possessions and abundance more generally. That includes honor. Chapter 6, verse 2, he talks about status and position and education and popularity, these things that come with honor, position. But it also includes things like family and health, longevity. You see that in verses 3 and 6 of chapter 6. And sometimes he just speaks generically about life's good things. Things like leisure and art and food and friends. But in line with the rest of this dark book, the preacher wants us to understand that as good as money and wealth can be, in and of themselves, they cannot ultimately satisfy us. To use the preacher's distinctive and disturbing phrase, he would say to us today, if he were here, that Bitcoin, like everything else in this broken world, falls under the category of vanity, a word that means smoke, vapor, emptiness. Bitcoin is a gift from God, and we should thank him for it. We should seek to use it for his glory and for the good of this world. But Bitcoin will always and only be a gift. It can never be the giver, and so it can never truly fulfill us or fix us like he can and he will. And so it's a passage that offers a warning, not just to us, but also about us. A warning as we constantly hunger to stack more and more and more. But ultimately, it's a passage offering an encouragement. It's a warning about us, but it's an encouragement also about God. It's an encouragement that God wisely rules over all of the wealth and all the pleasures of this world, including Bitcoin and all of the blessings that it brings. If you're like me, you are probably quick to say and to think, well, of course I know that Bitcoin is not God. Of course I know that Bitcoin will never ultimately satisfy me. But the reality is that I and we often think and dream and act and worry otherwise. I mean, think about the kinds of things that keep you awake at night, especially in a bear market. We need this warning. We need this encouragement. The passage I'm focusing on comes at the end of the first half of the whole book. It's a kind of conclusion to everything the preacher has been saying so far. Rhetorically, as you can kind of see up here in my outline I gave you, the passage is structured as an X. The first point shows up again at the end. The second point shows up in the second to last position, and the main point is in the middle. Chapter 5, verses 8 to 12, and then chapter 6, verses 7 to 9, at the beginning and the very end, they speak generally to us about how chasing wealth won't satisfy us. That's the first negative points, the first of 2 points made in this passage. The passages that are immediately touching those, chapter 5, verses 13 to 17, and then chapter 6, verses 1 to 6, they describe examples of how that can be true. How is it that wealth doesn't satisfy you? The preacher tells us about what he calls 2 grievous evils, how and why chasing wealth leaves us so unsatisfied. But then in the middle, chapter 5, verses 18 to 20, that's what I started reading this morning. In the middle, you have the main point of the whole thing. It's about how we can and we should accept the goods and wealth that God does provide, wherever and however he does so. That's the second positive point. The first point is wealth won't satisfy you. The second point is, but enjoy what God's given you. So let's dig into that a little bit. The first point from the wings at either end of the passage. Be careful. There's a danger here of building your life on pursuing wealth. Right at the very beginning, I didn't read it, but if you look down, if you have a Bible in front of you, chapter 5, verses 8 and 9, they help us transition from a passage that is fairly different, but is related. In the beginning of chapter 5 there, you have a passage about how people try to play games with God when they go to worship him. It's a passage about how people talk, a big talk about God. They put on a show, a very religious show for people, but that it's ultimately empty and selfish. And so the passage that we're on today, the passage about wealth, begins, it might seem kind of strange, but it begins by showing us how people play games not with God in the temple, not with God in worship, but how people play games with God in the city, in the political sphere, in the state. The sage says there in verse 8 of chapter 5, he says, if you see the poor being oppressed by political leaders, if you see them being fleeced by bureaucrats, he says, don't be surprised by that. He says, what do you expect? This is just the way it works. This is a king who's been binging on the Ron Paul Liberty Report. We hear him saying all these things and we say, yeah, amen. That's right. He says to us, he says, of course the poor are getting robbed. Of course the poor are getting ripped off. Because those with political power and influence have the same human proclivities as all humans do. They tend towards greed. They tend towards selfishness, except that they are extraordinarily powerful. They have powerful friends who protect them, powerful friends over them who watch out for them. He's saying in departments and agencies, companies, schools, even churches, because they are filled with people who tend towards greed and violence, he says these institutions and these leaders tend to take on their own cultures, their own patterns of enriching themselves and protecting themselves at the expense of the weak. But greed, this is how we transition now from playing games with God in the temple to playing games with God in the state now to what's going on with us in our own hearts. He's saying greed is not only a danger for other people, it's not just a problem for people that are out there working for the state. This is not just a problem for the man, and we need to just stick it to him all the time. He's saying greed is a problem for everybody. Wealth and building your life on top of it can be a great danger for any of us, including Bitcoiners. Chapter 5, verse 10, he's reminding us that the one who loves money and wealth will never be satisfied by it. He says, when goods increase, they increase who eat them. What advantage has their owner but to see them with his eyes? As the number goes up, he's saying, you are probably going to find yourself with many more expenses. You are probably going to find yourself with many would-be patrons who want your support. You will probably find yourself with many people who want to be your friend, who want to enjoy your stuff and your connections. And so the preacher is warning us that chasing wealth is ultimately unsatisfying, not just because you tend to spend it when you have it, although that's true, not just because the people around you are going to consume it for you and be very glad to do that, but also, he says, because you are now going to be worrying about it. You have a lot more to think about, a lot more to try to prevent being lost. He says, sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. This anxiety that comes when you have more things. If you look down at the very end of the passage there in chapter 6, you can see the same kind of point being made. Chapter 6, verse 7, he says, all the toil of man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is not satisfied. And so wealth and success and status and experiences, they never deliver what they promise. They disappoint us. He goes on, what advantage has the wise over the fool? The answer, surprisingly, in a book commending wisdom to us, the answer, at least in this regard, is that the wise man has no advantage over the fool. No matter how wise you are, you still have appetites that cannot and will not be satisfied merely by the wealth of this world. And so he concludes in chapter 6, verse 9, with this proverb. He says, better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite. We'll come back to that towards the end. But he's saying that it's better to be content with what you can see in front of you than to constantly be hungering for what you do not yet have. So now let's look at the two situations that he gives us as illustrations of how this can be true, about why and how wealth doesn't satisfy. There's one that starts in chapter 5, verse 13. The other one starts at the beginning of chapter 6. He describes both of them as grievous evils that he's seen. The first one in chapter 5, wealth does not satisfy us ultimately because you cannot always keep it. Wealth doesn't satisfy because you can't always keep it. We hear about a man who gathers lots of wealth, but he gathers them, the preacher tells us, to his own hurt. He's a hoarder. He's a miser. He does not benefit from or enjoy his wealth because of that. He does not use it for the good of other people around him. He's collected everything. He's not enjoying it. He's not able to use it. But then in verse 14, he says this, those riches were lost in a bad venture. This is the guy who went all in on FTX. He thought he was protecting himself. He was trying to hang on to all of it, but he loses everything. And so now verse 14, he has nothing, the preacher tells us, he has nothing to pass on to his son. There's no future for him anymore. As Bitcoiners, we pride ourselves on how self-custody and self-storage, for all intents and purposes, means you cannot lose your Bitcoin. But even so, we do have to acknowledge there is always a small danger of losing it somehow. But even if we have a perfect multi-sig wallet with keys that we have spread around to lots of wonderful friends, or lots of wonderful companies, or lots of wonderful locations that will always be there for us, even if we do that, in the end, death will take your Bitcoin anyways. The preacher says, as the man came from his mother's womb, so shall he go again. Naked as he came, he shall take nothing for his toil. Just as he came, so shall he go. What gain is there to him who toils for the wind? You see, it's only a matter of time before the grave forces every one of us into bankruptcy. And so the man who tried so hard to accumulate everything and to hang on to it, his bad venture, his knowledge of his coming death, the preacher says, all of that leaves him to brood, quote, in darkness and in much vexation. That means he's irritated and annoyed, and sickness and anger. 6th century philosopher Boethius said that the most miserable misfortune is to have been happy once. And so that's the first situation showing us why and how wealth don't satisfy. Even with Bitcoin, you cannot always keep it. The second situation, though, maybe is going to be haunting for us more because we have all these ways that we like to point to that we can protect our Bitcoin. And so the second one maybe is going to hit closer to home. The second grievous evil. There at the beginning of chapter 6, he says, wealth doesn't satisfy not just because you can't always keep it, but also now because you can't always enjoy it. You can't always enjoy your wealth. Here you hear about now a different man, a man to whom he says God gives wealth and possessions and honor. He lacks nothing of all that he desires. Yet God does not give him the power to enjoy them, but a stranger enjoys them. So here you have a man who could have everything he could ever want. He has financially, relationally, vocationally, he's got it all. He's got a huge, perfect family all around him. All of his kids are well-behaved and well-educated and well-adjusted. Hyperbolically, the preacher says, let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that this guy has 100 of these spectacularly well-behaved children. And also, let's imagine that this man lives for 2,000 years. And think about, if you've been around Bitcoin stuff for a while, you will hear some Bitcoiners getting very speculative about how wonderful the world's going to be when Bitcoin takes over. Think about those dreams, the most fantastical anti-seed oil carnivore tech bro. Bitcoin's going to go to $11 billion. Think about what that crazy podcaster is imagining and multiply that times 10. That's who the preacher wants us to consider. He has it all, but he does not enjoy any of it. It doesn't satisfy him. Ironically, God is the one who has given him the wealth. Wealth is always a gift from God. God is the one who has given the wealth, but God has not given the ability to enjoy it. And so the sage says very darkly, it would be better to be a stillborn baby than to be miserable in the midst of success and plenty. God withholding the ability to enjoy life may be a form of his judgment on the greedy. It may be a way of God reminding us that he is the only thing our hearts ultimately need and should desire. It may be a way of God lovingly shaping and maturing his people. C.S. Lewis said that God whispers to us in our pleasure, but shouts to us in our pain. I'm a pastor, and so people tend to talk to me about deeper things, maybe, than they would with other people, and some of you have become friends to me. But even just in the last 24 hours, I've talked with a few of you, and you've told me some dark, struggling things going on in your lives. Wealth does not satisfy because you can't always keep it. Wealth doesn't satisfy because you can't always enjoy it. They're both grievous evils that the sage has seen under the sun. But look at chapter 5, verse 18. He says, now here is something, he's been telling us all these depressing things. He said, here's something horrible about the world. Here's something that's even more horrible about the world. But then he says this, here's something good and fitting. Here's something wonderful I've seen. It's in the middle of the passage, but it's the main point of the whole thing. He says, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun the few days of his life that God's given him. I don't know if you caught this, but God barely shows up in most of that passage. He's hardly mentioned. But here, right in the middle, in just a couple of verses, he's all over the place. Wealth does not and will not satisfy our deepest needs and longings, but he says God does, and God will. And so he says you can and you should enjoy his gifts in this world as you recognize them as his gifts. We need to receive and stack and spend and give our wealth in a God-centered way, remembering that God is the giver. He's the owner. He's the landlord. He's the provider and the producer of all things. And so the preacher goes on to say that if God's given you wealth and possessions and the ability to enjoy them, he says, that's great. Now receive them gratefully. They are a gift. Verse 20, he says, God does sometimes keep us occupied with joy with his simple gifts around us. He helps us to forget how miserable and dark this frustrating and futile world often is. And so the sage says, whether you are rich or poor, instead of constantly hungering for more and more and more somewhere else and at some other time, he says, enjoy whatever gifts God has given you here and now, as simple and as mundane as they might be. Every breath, every bite, every heartbeat, every tree, every satoshi, every friendship, anything that is in any way true or good or beautiful, all of it is a gift from a generous God. In Bitcoin world, we talk often about the importance of low time preference, of living for the future, delaying gratification. And there's a lot of wisdom and a lot of truth to that, and the Bible speaks quite a bit about that kind of thing. But there's a sense in which, the preacher reminds us, we should have high time preference. We should live for the moment. We should enjoy what God's given us now. That we are profoundly shortchanging ourselves and the people around us if we merely live for a future that's not here yet. God has surrounded us with his gifts. The preacher says, enjoy them. But the sage here, in one of the darkest corners of the Old Testament, can only get so far. He ends up banging into the impenetrable brick wall of the final insolvency of death. We can and we should enjoy God's gifts here as they come. That's true. But I don't know if you caught this. He throws his hands up at the end. He says, in the end, death's going to take everything from us. And he says, I don't really know what's going to happen after that. And so that's how chapter 6 ends as it transitions to the second half of the book. He realizes that at the end of the day, you cannot escape God's mysterious and often baffling rule over our lives and our world. Look at chapter 6, verse 10. He says, it's known what man is. That is to say, he is limited, he is finite, he's not God. It's known that he is not able to dispute with one who's stronger than he, which is to say, the unlimited, infinite God. And so in chapter 6, verse 12, with this grim sigh, he says, who knows what's good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? Who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? You see, ultimately, it is not much of a consolation to tell somebody, well, just enjoy life. Just seize the day. This too will pass. That's not ultimately much of a comfort. As great as it is, in the end, Bitcoin can only help us and our neighbors and our families on this side of the grave. And that grave is coming much sooner than we'd like to think. Our appetites and our longings for goodness and happiness and satisfaction can only really be resolved in God beyond the grave. And now, centuries after the sage wrote, God did enter into this vaporous world to conquer the grave. The gospel account of the Apostle John tells us that Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. And then his question to the woman there in the story is also his question to us today. Do you believe this? The bodily resurrection of Jesus is the guarantee and the down payment that anybody who believes in him will also be resurrected with him, along with this entire frustrated and futile universe where we will enjoy it forever. Our appetites can only be satisfied in the world to come, and that's ultimately why we don't have to despair over the things of this world, why we don't have to despair over entrenched injustice, over lost wealth, over missed opportunities. Looking to the eternal life of the resurrection kingdom of Jesus is what ultimately frees us from this miserable, vaporous slavery to greed and envy and anxiety. This is why the Apostle Paul, at the end of the New Testament, tells his protege Timothy in his first letter to him, he says, encourage the wealthy Christians in your church. He says, encourage them, yes, that God has given us everything to enjoy. This is echoing the preacher of Ecclesiastes. Wealth is a gift from God. Enjoy it while you have it. It's even good and holy. You have a duty before God to enjoy it and to use it. But Paul says, don't forget to remind them that even when you're rich, you should not build your life on what he calls the uncertainty of riches. He says, be very careful, rich Christians. Be very careful about the constant danger of falling in love with your money. Instead, Paul says the wealthy are to be rich in good works. They're to be generous and ready to share. Why? Paul says, so that they might store up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. And so even as the Apostle Paul is saying, yes, the things of this world are God's gifts. We should enjoy them, probably a lot more than we do. But he's also saying the same thing as Jesus. Something beyond what the sage said or even knew. That there's life and wealth and happiness and family and home to be enjoyed forever and ever beyond the grave, when Jesus raises us in this world from the dead. Jesus came and died on the cross in our place so that we could be forgiven of all of our idolatry and greed and envy, and thereby be able to enjoy the gift of this eternal world of constant gifts from a giving God. Does the way that we think about, the way that we spend, the way that we enjoy Bitcoin show that we're living for this eternal wealth? Thanks.